difficult weekend for our area and our state, especially, of course, for Marysville Pilchuck High School and the people of the Tulalip tribes, our neighbors, our friends. Many of you gathered even here at this service, and certainly at our earlier services today, have various connections to either the high school or the event itself, or to the Tulalip peoples. As things have unfolded, people are seeking one another out to look for support and to ask that inevitable question, why did this happen? Even I've heard people say, how could God let this happen? And we have to be careful, even if we mean well, about being too quick with that answer that says it's God's will. Because if we say that to the parents whose children are striving to get through the crisis that they're in, either those who are suffering from gunshot wounds, and their children survive, and that's God's will, what message are we sending to the parents whose children have already died? Is that too God's will? And if we send that message, what are we unintentionally saying about God? A God who would take away their children and allow their children to die in violence. I'm fairly certain as I read the gospel and Christ's teaching that God is not willing harm to the people. That God is not allowing or somehow passively permitting that people should die violently, or that people's children should be taken from them or suffer in the way that they are experiencing suffering, or that parents should suffer that loss. Life is the nature in which we have it. This mortal life, with this profound gift that God gives each of us of free will. As we act through our lives in free will, we can only hope that in mind and body and soul, we have people around us to help us in our choices. But even then, when we may be surrounded by the most loving of people, things can happen inside of us that no parent and no one in society can change or make different, because it's happening all inside and it's not being shared. Even then, there is a sense of helplessness, of not being able to make an impact or a difference when our young people, or our elders for that matter, keep our lives so silent and so secret from one another. For the Tulalip nations, know that the Tulalips are actually 5 different tribes that are in association with one another. And that Jalen Freiberg is Snohomish in that tribal affiliation of the Tulalip. And that his family, the Freiberg family, is well known and well respected among those peoples, and even very much respected for how the Tulalip peoples have generously contributed to the various causes of our region and the various needs that have arisen even most recently at Osho. They responded generously and out of that sense that these were their neighbors. And they raised Jalen. He was known, as I read it and have heard now from others, a young man who was happy as a child, who was active in his cultural value system, who did everything that one would want to admire, taking early in his life emblems of leadership among his people and respect among his people. His dancing shirt and his feathered headdress. He had so much promise as a leader. For him to take the actions that he did certainly brings heartbreak to all his relatives, all his people, all his friends and peers at the high school. Heartbreak at his loss, and he took his own life, and heartbreak at what was perpetrated by his hand. People are struggling with that question. Why? There is a writer who's a guest columnist for the Seattle Times. His name is Andrew Godin. He is also a member of the Tulalip tribes, and he, of course, knew Jalen and all these other kids to whom he was related, who were victims of the event. And one of the things that he writes in his guest column is that while what Jalen did was monstrous, he was not a monster. And that it was hard to hear for Andrew how people across the country are judging him. And so quickly moving to that place in their quest for answers about what he must have been, or what his parents must have been, or his culture must have been, or his friends, etc., etc. And all those kinds of arguments do, even if they are well-intended, whether it's about gun control, or about youth suicide, whether it's psychologists weighing in on what could have been the problem. None of that is especially helpful to helping bridge divides in a community at a time when we are really needing to do that. To come together and support one another. There are so many communities, sub-communities of Marysville and Everett and our surroundings that have been affected. The high school, obviously, and within that, the students who now move forward in life with that experience. And that story is a part of their personal narrative. And the teachers, educators who get into teaching because they love and care about young people. And they having to witness this for themselves and knowing full well the impact it will have on the very young people that they love. And they're supporting one another. And then the first responders who came to that scene, the police, the paramedics, the fire departments, the nurses and doctors who came from the surrounding area to help triage, to be there as a community for another community, and how impacted they are. I know no first responder in my work with them who deals well with tragedies involving young people or children. They get into their business to save lives. And when they can't do that, or when they see such devastating injury, they are deeply affected by that. They couldn't stop it either. And then the people who receive their kids into the hospital, all the medical staff, the surgeons and nurses and care providers, how they have to rally together and process that. It takes work. We sometimes in our culture undervalue emotional labor. It doesn't really show up on a paycheck. But emotional labor in all that we do takes its toll, and it's real. And we have to do that work for ourselves, or we burn out emotionally. And so all of that sub-community from among us also needs our support. So with all of these different communities, I read our lessons for today and this wonderful gospel reading from Matthew. And we have two parts of what's going on in that narrative with Jesus' interaction with the Pharisees. And the first is they test him And they ask him a question about the nature of the law, and then he asks the question in turn. It's a wonderful lawyer thing to do. You ask me something, it means that if you're answering it, you have accepted the invitation as a student to give an answer. And in kind, if they're willing and they're willing to receive a question, they too will acknowledge what they might be asked being studied. Now, that first part, when they ask him, what's the most important law? Because for Pharisees, law is life, and it's spiritual life, and it's relationship with God. So what's the most important law in that relationship? And I love how he answers with the summary of the law. And there's two parts to that summary of the law. The first is love God with all your heart and mind and soul. I love that I can love God with my mind, and I don't have to check that at the door. I love that. And also to love your neighbor as yourself. That somehow in this experience of love of God, it's not real. It's just in our head and not really made manifest unless we are living it out loud, living it in life on behalf of others, actually being loving. And in fact, St. Paul, in his letter that we heard from, he makes that point. He says, he enumerates these hardships, and then he gets into, but we do all this gently and with perseverance because we love you. We love you, and that's why we do it. And he exhorts them to do loving things for one another. The summary of the law of love God and love your neighbor is very effective for this reason. If you took the 10 Commandments and enumerated all of them, you would find that the first 5 are covered by that first summary. Love God with all your heart and mind and soul. And then the second 5 are covered by that next piece. Love your neighbor as yourself. So here they are. The first 5, all about loving God. I am the Lord your God. So you acknowledge that. Thou shalt bring no false idols before me. Do not take the name of the Lord in vain. Remember the Sabbath, which is God's holy day. Keep it holy. And honor thy father and thy mother. That refers to God as well, because the parental units in Hebrew tradition are the ones that teach the children the law and the values associated with the law, and fulfill thereby that covenant relationship into the next generation. So that too is about God and loving God. And then the second half, love thy neighbor as thyself. These are all about how to be with your neighbor or not be with your neighbor. Thou shalt not kill and murder. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against another. And thou shalt not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. But to be a good neighbor involves building them up, involves that acting out of love. Now, in the case of what we've just experienced, people are questing around with that question, what to do. We would like to do something. We want to be able to respond in a way that's meaningful or effective. But one of the most important things we can do that is extremely loving is to simply be present to it. Be present to the grief of it. Not to hide from it and say, well, it's affected me, but I gotta do my day. It's on my heart, but I don't want to talk about it. Because it's only in the work of grief, all this work going on around us for others so close to it. If we allow ourselves to be present to their grief, we don't have to do anything about it. We don't have to give any simple and not helpful answer. We don't have to theologize about it. We just simply can be present to their grief. And as a community, that means the world to the Tulalip people who will be keeping a lot of this among themselves and helping one another. And yet, understanding and recognizing the challenge that maybe they need to be open to receiving that support. And what does that look like? Because of the whole history of Native American relationships in this country, you can well imagine why a certain isolation might be in operation. Even though they reach out to us, they would be reluctant to allow us to reach into them. And so being present to them, being honoring their losses and their challenges, and participating in ways that may come available to us of vigils or services, a lot more of that is going to happen. That's just begun. And so showing up, you can do that. And when our young people have questions about why did this happen, being present to the question. One of the great things about Christianity is our ability to be present to mystery. It's the least comfortable part of our spirituality and the most necessary. To just simply be in the why and not the answer. Be in the why, in the questioning, because that's that wellspring of grief, being there at the wellhead. And so for us today, I invite us to remember these young people. We'll be praying for them in a few minutes. And keeping them in your hearts, keeping the whole high school in mind, and knowing that God is present with us, but only insofar as we are present to this moment. In Christ's name.